to strategies for project development, all kinds of things. So I'm excited to hear from Dan tonight. Currently, he is available for hiring or contracting for Clojure work, and I'm sure he'll tell us any more about what he's up to. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dan.
Hey, great. Thanks, Tori. Sorry, I just got this new computer and I haven't done any video conferencing on it before, so it can't find my camera. We're just not going to worry about it. I am going to share my screen in a second. Actually, yeah, let me do that really quick. All right. Oh, okay. Well, we don't need it yet. Okay, so the title of this talk is about folklore, which is kind of an odd topic, I think, for a meetup centered around a programming language. I've never heard one like it, and it kind of embarrassed me when I realized that was kind of what I wanted to talk about. But I thought, no, it's still worth it, and I think there's actually something there. This isn't just going to be like me telling like stories and stuff. We can do a bit better than that. Instead, what the title is that programming is folklore, and that's a little bit of a different idea. And so what do I mean by that? The idea is that the defining trait of folklore is that it's not universal, it's parochial. It often doesn't translate very well outside its domain. Everyone kind of knows their own folklore of whatever culture they're from, and just kind of doesn't really have much interest in folklore from outside their domain or other culture. So it's very limited in its context. It's not optimized for universal appeal. If you look at a lot of actual folklore, sometimes it can often be kind of hard to understand. It might use non-standard English or just some strange terms or phrases. There's a book I loved when I was a kid called East of the Sun, West of the Moon, which is a collection of Scandinavian folktales. And it keeps using a unit of measurement called L's, E-L-L-L. It talks about a troll with a nose that's 9 L's long. And I remember as a kid thinking, what on earth is an L? Another example might be Brer Rabbit, which some of you might be familiar with. Disney did it. It was a common trickster character in folktales among African slaves in the U.S. And let's see, I can't. So can I share? Can we enable screen sharing?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah, sorry, I just enabled it.
Okay, that's great. Let's see. I guess I will just share that. Well, actually, I'll share a bunch of different things. So, like, let's see, can I share that? Yes, I can. Oh, there we go. This is a screenshot of a Hacker News comment from 10 years ago. Everyone likes the efficacy of bite-sized quips and trivia, but the main problem with them is that they tend to become very domain-specific and border on nonsensical when you shift domains. And I have utmost sympathy for this complaint and this kind of reaction. I think there's a strong reaction that I have to kind of against folklore. I don't want to learn the minutiae of whatever stupid platform I'm hacking on today. I'd like to learn long-term principles that can help me, far into the future. That's one of the things that drew me to Clojure. I think it's one of the things that draws a lot of people. One of the fun things about Clojure is that there's no syntax. Okay, great. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, so, and it seems a little weird to think of programming as programming. Like, a lot of us are maybe working remote. You might be working for a company that's hundreds or thousands of miles away. So it doesn't seem like that there's much there on first glance relating programming. But I started to notice some weird things. The first was that a lot of the knowledge in our industry is transmitted in an informal ad hoc way. Actually, an example that occurred to me is it was Tori that taught me to start using into more in Clojure, if you're familiar with the function. And in turn, I was like, hey, check out reduce. There's a lot of fun things you can do with reduce. Both of us had access to the entire internet, like, a zillion Clojure books. And there was still something that, that ended up needing to be translated in person. Maybe, it didn't have to be that specifically, but so that was one thing I noticed, that a lot of the kind of knowledge ends up being transmitted in person. The first time I touched Docker was a couple of years ago, and it was the same kind of deal. I was hired to write Python and JavaScript, but there was Docker involved, and I was like, oh, what's this Docker compose? And they, so they taught me how to use Docker. That was how I learned how to use Docker professionally. And the second thing that I found interesting was not just that, like, oh, a lot of programming knowledge is kind of transmitted in the same way as folklore, but also how much like actual folklore there was. I don't know exactly what it is about software, but it's a really rich source of anecdotes and aphorisms, little lessons, and a zillion jokes. And I don't want to, like, one thing I was worried about when I was putting this together, is I thought, oh, what if I just present a bunch of folklore and like they think it's lame, and I'll just be the guy who presented like stupid jokes or something. So I wanted to avoid that. So I'm going to play it safe. And instead, I'm going to play this Rich Hickey clip. And let's see. Open up YouTube. All right. And I think I can just share my screen. Okay. I don't know if the audio is going to come through to you guys, so let me know if it does real quick. This is from Simple Made Easy. Is that coming through to you guys? No, it's not.
But I think there's just a checkbox somewhere in the controls where you can make it include your computer's audio.
Let's see. Shoot.
It usually happens when you go to share.
Let me stop sharing and then start again then. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Okay. Great. And that was, actually, I'm just going to use that same link again. Okay, this is a classic talk from Rich Hickey. Simple Made Easy. I recommend it to everyone. If a lot of people watching this will already have seen it. So, but this joke, I don't know. I just thought it needed to be shared again.
Now, of course, everybody's going to start moaning, but I have all this speed. I'm agile, I'm fast. This easy stuff is making my life good because I have a lot of speed. So what kind of runner can run as fast as they possibly can from the very start of a race? Right. Only somebody who runs really short races. Okay? But of course, we are programmers and we're smarter than runners, apparently, because we know how to fix that problem, right? We just fire the starting pistol every 100 yards and call it a new sprint. I don't know why they haven't figured that out, but right.
Oh, I love that. All right, stop doing it. So, okay, so that was. Then there was one other thing that really kind of got me onto this track, and we're not going to go there yet. But it was a blog post Kyle Kingsbury wrote. And I don't know much about Kyle. I've never interacted with him professionally or otherwise. He's a Clojure programmer. Beyond that, I don't know much about him. But he wrote a blog post, a series of blog posts called, the first one I believe was called Reversing the Technical Interview. And the second was called Hexing the Technical Interview. And some of you will already have read it. For the benefit of those who haven't, I'm going to tell you about it because it's kind of a lot to take in. So the conceit of this blog post is there's an ageless witch, and she might be like 1,000 years old, but she looks 30 forevermore. She's forever young. And she's from a matriarchal clan or a tribe of witches just like her, somewhere in the fjords and the mountains of Scandinavia. And it's from the Philip Pullman His Dark Materials series, if you've heard of it, The Golden Compass, if you're familiar. Anyway, this ancient wise witch who lives this very tribal existence. She's going through the first round of interviews at a nameless Silicon Valley tech company. But she's not a normal witch. She's a programming witch. She's a very gifted programmer. So she does things in ways that to humans like us would just seem to be crazy or impossible. Now, kind of by definition, a lot of these are hard to describe. Like, part of the point of them is that they're hard to understand at first. It's amazing that they work at all, that anyone like went through the work of making this work. You're kind of supposed to have your jaw agape when you finally get it. But I think we can look at one of the simpler ones, and not even the whole thing, just a very small part of it to get a taste. And I know actually some who've worked with me and Tori have already seen this. Okay, so the interviewer, I'd like to walk you through a common interview question, reverse a linked list. And so the witch says, okay. And so like, okay, this is a function, and it's even a little weirder. Like, what's going on here? I'm with the interviewer. I'm just as surprised. But it's a function called cons, which is, I guess we still call it cons in Clojure. This is head and this is tail. And interestingly, it's a function that is returning an anonymous function. And that anonymous function that it returns is an if statement. So this is a closure with an S, for those of you kind of new to the concept. It's returning a function that accesses these variables that are passed in, the head and the tail. And so then the idea is, so the first argument you pass in is the head, and the rest is the tail of the list, which may be another function. So this right here, oops, this returns a list of just 2. And this passed in as the tail to this call, it returns a list of 1 and then 2. And the way you access members of this list is by you give it a series of falses until you give it true, and that's the index of the element you want. So I'm going to stop there. Like, my head hurts even just trying to explain like the very first part of this. Just for context, he then writes a function that imitates nth on this weird kind of list, then something to print it, and then something to reverse it. And I highly recommend going through it sometime. I do not recommend trying to explain it to anyone, because every time I try it, it kills me. But it's really quite fun to read. Okay, but that was just to kind of give you the sort of things that happen in these blog posts, because this is the one that really grabbed me. Let's see. Oh, so this is another one called Hexing the Technical Interview. And just as a broad overview, Clojure is built on the Java virtual machine, actually on Java specifically. And the Java virtual machine is a virtual machine. So it has its kind of own little like fake emulated CPU that it's running. And specifically its own kind of assembly called bytecode. And so he's asked to solve this problem in Clojure, any language he wants, and he ends up instead writing raw JVM bytecode to solve it. And we're not going to go through this. This is like a 5-hour project just to understand, but there were 2 parts I wanted to highlight. Here he's just writing an array of bytes. Actually, it's kind of neat. If you see, here we go. He feeds the whole thing through with the thrush operator. So it's just all the hex code you see from here. All of these are just entries in this one long vector. Anyway, this part, I think apparently these are the magic numbers, the magic bytes you have to put in for to create a method in JVM bytecode. No one living who's sane does this or knows this. But there's a very different approach kind of mentioned in here. Every young witch in your clan was required to memorize these bytes. Such pride you felt when you first incanted a class without the training wheels of Javac, the Java compiler. In other words, not even writing writing normal Java and using the Java compiler to turn it into bytecode, just writing the raw bytecode. But even more interesting, I found, was this part. Here we go. For some reason, he needs to specify 22 in there. I have no idea why. Don't ask me why. This whole thing is very complicated. But he needs 22 constants, and apparently for the purposes of memory management, he needs 23. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't exactly understand why this works. But here, what's important, what I wanted to highlight here is how she talks about it. I'm sorry, isn't 0x17 decimal 23, not 22? Again, you recite Singtong til Javanisen. Beg pardon? The Javanese. Surely you have heard of him. He is a small magical man, something like a gnome, who inhabits every JVM. If you do not set out an extra constant for him, he can cause seg faults. But keep the Javanese happy, and your Moodysees will be fair. It is a story from your childhood. You remember your mother chanting offsets as she stirred the stew. Tu baita for buffering and visa, ag extra until Javanese. It is a happy memory, and you lose yourself in it until. Okay. I mean, all right, let's just acknowledge something. This is pretty weird, right? Like, it's fine to acknowledge that. It's kind of weird. But this really grabbed me. And it wasn't that I wanted to write anything in Hex like this ever. It was more this idea of, wow, like having this sort of, the blog post author is drawing our attention to this idea of a culture where this stuff is just sort of taught in the womb. She learned that from hearing her mother sing it while stirring stew. So the point is that she doesn't treat, to us, writing that stuff in Hex is horrible and looks ridiculous. But a lot of it is just kind of familiarity. Learning how to do that stuff is completely normal among her tribe. And it doesn't come from a book or a manual. It comes from stories around the campfire and a culture that thinks knowing this stuff is good and important and worthwhile. Time for another. There's another. This seemed like the best place to inject this. This is, a lot of you will have seen this comic. Lisp is over half a century old and it still has this perfect timeless air about it. I wonder if the cycles will continue forever. A few coders from each new generation rediscovering the Lisp arts. And then we've got a Jedi saying, these are your father's parentheses, elegant weapons for a more civilized age. In other words, there's this idea of this, and this is not altogether untrue in the sense that Lisp really kind of fell out of fashion around the 70s after a lot of the defense-funded AI research didn't pan out. So Lisp was seen as this AI language, and then we didn't get AI, and everyone just kind of assumed, oh, it's the problem with Lisp. But so we've kind of had a Lisp revolution in the last couple of years. This isn't. I don't want to get into Lisp fanboyism here. I am a Lisp fanboy, but that's kind of not the point of this talk. It's more that again, we've got this idea that this is transmitted orally and almost in a hereditary manner, rather than in a formal and ambiguous manner. So here's what I find interesting, and because there is a point here where I think it can help us in our applications. If you're a software witch, if you're from some mythical tribe where everyone learns how to write compilers by the time they're age 4, suddenly there are very different solutions that become optimal than before. When I was working with Tori, I kind of had a joke about putting a REPL in that. Kind of the idea that, like whatever application we're working on, like, it'd be really nice if we included a REPL. And this, could be user-facing applications to non-technical users. And if you imagine a world where literally everyone knew Clojure, then I think people actually might get kind of tired of applications that work by rendering a GUI. They'd say like, hey, where's my REPL? I just, I'm very comfortable with like Clojure, and where's my through indicator, my thread combinator. In other words, in a different context, the correct way to write web apps would be very different. And this is what I find interesting, is because I think there's two kind of conflicting ideas here. One is that we kind of try and avoid folklore as much as we can in our design discussions. We want to stay with open standards. We don't want to do weird things that are hard to maintain. A lot of our talk about orally transmitted knowledge is kind of how do we get rid of that? We talk about the bus factor, like how many people have to get hit by a bus before no one on your team, before there aren't enough people left who know how to work everything. So we generally tend to kind of treat this parochialism as an enemy, and yet it pops up everywhere, and like with people working as hard as they can not to do it. And so I was thinking about why this is, and the conclusion I reached is that folklore is an adaptation for a world where context matters. And let me explain what I mean by that. I think we tend to fall in love with this idea of universal, cosmopolitan, invariant knowledge. One of the great things about Lisp is there's kind of no syntax. It's all just, functions at the front, everything else after. That's it. Now you know Lisp. But I think the benefits are slightly oversold, or at least a little myopic, because often what you need is to solve some problem, and solving it does require parochial knowledge. What's the first thing you do when you take a new job? You learn the code base. That you don't do that because you think it's going to teach you something enduring and immortal that you'll take to your grave. You do it because in the environment you're in, that's the best thing you can do. If you try and do everything from first principles, rewrite your own web framework, etc., you might even end up with a better product, maybe in the happy case, but it might just take so long that it will kind of be a moot point. So parochialism is a trade-off that we make for speed or convenience, and it's often a very good trade. I think we can all come up with examples where it's a bad trade, but I think a lot of the standards that we complain about today that kind of straitjacket us, well, they succeeded. The reason they're standards is because they came out, on time, and they fit their environment. Okay, there's one other kind of alternate universe I want to talk about, and I tried and I couldn't find the specific section of the YouTube clip. But some of you may be familiar with a language called APL, and APL looks very strange. I wonder if I can find, if I can spend 4 seconds and find a picture of some APL. Let's see. Here's some. I'm just going to share my screen really quick. Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar with APL, this is APL, and it looks insane. But this is actually an entire program. I can't read it. I have not yet gotten around to learning it. But APL is extremely compact. If you think about Clojure's pattern of taking collections and mutating them, then this does all of that, but like each single one of these is a combinator or a function. It's just a giant pipe of combinators and functions arranged just so. So this is like a quite substantial program. There's a kind of a meme where people will show Conway's Game of Life or some cellular automata in like one line of APL. Anyway, so actually the reason I had that link handy with Aaron Sue is because I was actually looking for a different talk of his where he was saying that APL tends to be very popular among statisticians and basically non-programmers, kind of non-computer scientists. And that he was kind of surprised about that. And one thing that he said that kind of blew my mind was he said, I think a lot of it is because I think a lot of developers, we tend to reach for abstraction. And of all the things that, when I say like parochial programming, abstraction is not one of the things I think that comes to mind. Like every language has abstraction, like, lack of abstraction kind of forces you to learn assembly and, but here he was saying that, that abstraction is not necessarily a terminal value. And his point was that APL can be so short that rather than writing a name for a function, you can just write the function right there. That the actual implementation is shorter than any name you could come up with for it in English. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. This was about where I had stopped. I have a bunch of resources that we can look at that were some of the things that kind of came to mind when I thought of this programming as folklore. There were some takeaways though that I wanted to get to. So I've used this term parochial a lot. It's not a bad thing. A lot of the time, being limited in scope is not the worst thing in the world. And I don't know, you can all see it here. I'm showing my screen, but there's this trope of like a long lost culture that that does everything just kind of better. It might not translate to the wider world, but you still want to live there. And the other thing that occurred to me was parochialism isn't necessarily bad. Somalia has no rules. Yeah, I'm going to stop showing my screen because actually there's quite a bit more material I just remembered. Somalia has no rules and nobody wants to live there. If you want to live a universal life unhindered by customs, then you can go live in Somalia, and nobody does that. So there was just one more thing that I wanted to share on. Was there's this idea of Afghanistan has a nickname of where empires go to die. In other words, I think the British invaded it back in the 1800s. The Russians did. I think even Genghis Khan did at some point. And nobody has really managed to kind of hold on to it. I'm not a prophet, but I think eventually the US will probably pull out at some point. And it's very strange. It's a one of the most kind of parochial places in the world. And I think a lot of the reason that the analogy that sprang to mind was that big companies are kind of in love with this idea of big overarching concepts. Agile, is the one that comes. And I don't think they or really anyone has come up with a very universal answer here. Back in the 60s and 70s, they used to talk about something called the software crisis, which was basically they started to realize that writing software was really hard and that they were going way over budget. And as far as I remember reading this and thinking, oh wow, so did they ever solve it? And I kept reading and I haven't found anything since. I think a lot of what's happened instead is we've kind of just learned to live with the messiness and the kind of specific nature. We fight against it, but a lot of the slack gets picked up by just being in some insanely profitable industry and being willing to pay the developers a lot to spend a lot of time. And that's just kind of the best answer we've come up with. Anyway, there were a couple takeaways from this, and one was realizing that I myself was in kind of a parochial culture in the sense of you learn Clojure, and it's great, but that doesn't make you as useful necessarily in a C++ shop, etc. And so it's not necessarily that parochialism is bad, nor is it good. It's just kind of there. Anyway, so being a fish and realizing that you're in an ocean, I think, has a lot of value. So that's basically the end of my talk. Thanks for listening. I'd be happy to hear any comments or thoughts on this. But yeah, otherwise, I'll turn the time over to the roundtable.
Thanks. I always enjoy the kind of thought adventures that happen when I talk with you or hear you talk about some of these ideas. One of the first things that came to my mind as we were listening to you was the way, I know when Clojure was younger, there were books and sort of this popular motion in the direction of creating DSLs, domain-specific languages. And I think one of the ideas behind these is that you can give them to somebody who doesn't know all of the language, like maybe not all of Clojure. Maybe they're a front-end developer or something else, and they can operate within your program using this DSL. And I think the tradition came to Clojure from broader Lisp, because Lisp itself has a long tradition of DSLs. But for whatever reason, and I tend to think it's because of this liking for, what did you call it? You called it universal cosmopolitan non-contextual knowledge. And I think that the favor for that kind of knowledge has made the DSL approach sort of less popular. And I guess also on the fringes of that idea is the whole concept of functional programming, because in functional programming with pure functions, you have this idea that, again, we want to stay away from context as much as possible. Do you read any more into that as far as DSLs and whether that's still a viable approach to things?
I think, and this is going to be the worst answer in the world, but I think it's very dependent on context. I think a lot of it depends on, in terms of your users, like what you're expecting. You know, are you in an organization? Are you just making something open source? What are you asking of them necessarily, and what are they getting out of it? Yeah, so kind of a lame answer, but yeah.
So thank you for this. This is my first time here. I'm actually based out of the San Francisco Bay Area. I decided to branch out a little bit, so thank you for hosting.
I'm actually in the Bay Area too, Jenny. I just recently moved from Utah. So.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah, would love to meet up during safer times.
Yeah.
Yeah, this actually, I really appreciate this. I've thought about this a lot over my years, and I've thought about DSLs a lot. I'm from the data domain, and query languages are a thing. But it's interesting, right? Like I think there is a difference between context and folklore. Like the surface area of my API, just what the function names are, that is part of my context. But the expectation is that I at least can doc generate that stuff, and it becomes much more discoverable. Like the onboarding process into that API is a tractable problem. It's not like training as a Shaolin monk for 20 years. Right. And I think a lot about the economics of this, because, you know, this stuff doesn't exist in isolation. Like when I make a decision to choose something that's more parochial, and sometimes I do that, it's because I know I'm staffing a team that I expect very low turnover and I expect very low growth. And so it's okay, right? I'm just going to like train that person up over time, and they're going to get into the culture, and it's fine. And then the question is like, you know, why does industry bias so much toward low context? And I think it's because they can't keep the turnover down. If you inherently work on a project that is inherently interesting, like I'm working on a data engine right now, it includes an implementation of a query language. Like it's inherently like just like academically fun. I love it anyway. And it's kind of like, I would expect turnover to be high for the right people, or excuse me, turnover to be very low for the right people. And I'm going to make the choice to use Clojure, which I am, because of that. But if I'm working on like a DevOps platform or something like that, something much less inherently satisfying to those of us who have that bent, I expect turnover to be high, and then I have to like kind of reduce to the lowest common denominator. I don't know. Those are kind of my thoughts on it over time, you know, kind of like staffing teams.
That was really good. I love that different perspective that you're able to share. Thanks, Jenny.
Hey guys, I have really bad bandwidth tonight, so I apologize for that. I might cut in and out. But yeah, just to reflect on Jenny's thought, when we started Videra and, it was all in Clojure, it was like, that was my biggest concern, was like, we're really going to commit a stack, an entire stack, to a language where if you look at the distribution graphs of like the Stack Overflow surveys and those kinds of things, Clojure is the least used language in the community, but it's also the most like quote unquote loved. I didn't look deeply into how they measured love, but that is kind of the statistic, which is interesting. It's very interesting. So the Clojure community is a very dedicated kind of core group of coders. At the same time, I'm always like, as sort of, the entrepreneurial side of me always thinks about, okay, how to build that community that it might intrinsically have opportunities in and of itself, but also it lowers the risk to any hiring managers looking at or taking on Clojure, as well as any developers, going down that path on their stack. So that's kind of one of the goals of like this meetup, and I hope other meetups too, is just how to get it out there in the community, and how to introduce what seems like, that's the problem in the literature and the culture of our community. It's like, well, this is a really smart thing, and this is for smart people. And so a lot of people, I think that right away, if you're the type of person where maybe you took a path that was perceived as easy and it gave you a lot of really good feedback really quickly, and you got value, you might just not know that you might be uncomfortable taking those perceptively steeper paths, but they're just as, they're, at least for me, and I think for everyone else here, there's not a lot of difference that you experience in coding, say, JavaScript in React versus Clojure, Clojure script, reframe, Datomic, Datalog stuff. So it's interesting. It's always, and I was thinking about that too, as Dan was talking about folklore. It's like, how can we, sort of make Clojure a more common opportunity for both development teams wanting to pick a language as well as people looking for new placement. So yeah, it's an interesting idea.
I think, and this is kind of a just so answer, but I think a lot of the answer is succeeding. Basically, the more Clojure projects succeed by whatever metric, I think the more confident you will be in future projects, either whether you're making that decision for yourself or whether you're selling it to management. But also, the more that will be a data point in someone else's head, like, oh yeah, they used Clojure, it worked. Like, kind of a glib answer, but I don't know.
No, I think that's a good point, because a lot of people do look at, like, there's a couple of sites out there, right, that say, here are different stack configurations, and here are the companies using these stacks. And I found one that was really good. I can't find it anymore. That was like, it had essentially, let's say maybe up to 500 implementations of different web apps that was doing performance benchmarking. So the same web app, but in, 500 stack configurations, different databases, languages, etc., frameworks. And, but there's a lot out there, but yeah, that's an interesting idea, as far as how that kind of propagates as well. It's also funny, like the machine learning community, it's like right now there's really like one language in machine learning, and it'd be cool to see, like, especially like the modern day Lisp, kind of re-emerge into machine learning.
As to jump on that, I'll just make everybody aware. So on Thursday, the Clojure Data Science Group is having one of the regular meetings about common Lisp for Clojurians, but they do a lot of discussion of AI and data science and Clojure. So just kind of tag that on.
Hey, cool. Could you post a link to that, Corey? Or Tori? Sorry.
Yeah, I will. I'll put it here in the chat.
One thing that I'd forgotten, actually, since we have a bit of a pause, was I wanted to I'm going to share my screen again for a sec. I wanted to show a kind of neat project that I happened to come on. This is a, oh, yeah, that's still there. This is not my project. I'm not responsible for the million alert messages here. Wow, let's multiply it. Something is up there. But this is a REPL that's just left open to the world. And it's actually kind of cool. So this, the source, this is the source right here. It's just, and any command you put in here in Clojure is going to be run in this in this running REPL. So this is basically a REPL, and in other words, you can self-modify the actual application. So the way it works right now is it still 30 seconds? So every 30 seconds, what it used to be is you could put in whatever you want and it wouldn't execute. Actually, it would keep all the submissions, and then every hour the highest voted one would be executed. And I kind of found this, and of course the first thing I did was I changed to 30 seconds instead of an hour to make development easier. And then I think I made it remember my name. So normally it just uses a hash of the IP address. I just used a nickname I use. Anyway, I don't know. This is basically, oh, the other thing is this text box used to be a lot smaller and more cramped, and it didn't have a word counter. So I added that. But the funny thing is I didn't add any of this through a pull request. I did this kind of remotely with tweezers through this thing, executing something once every hour. Anyway, I just thought it was worth sharing.
Okay, I've shared that link in both the Slack and also the chat here. So, but I also want to bring up another point that I think. So first off, I loved Jenny's remark on how much depends on the turnover you expect, and I realized from that it really impacts my perspective, because my situation is I work at a university, and my teams, many of whom are here tonight, are student driven. And so when you're dealing with students, you innately have a timer on everything because they graduate. So that's just the way it works. And I've known of professors who actually left academia and went to industry because they wanted long-term coworkers and long-term teams. So I think that's a great insight that Jenny brought up. Another one, I wanted to push back, well, not push back, but offer a counter perspective on what Brian brought up, because he mentioned, how much we want to open Clojure up and make it inviting for people to enter. And I think I agree with that, but I have heard an argument in the other direction where people question, do we really want a low barrier to entry so everybody joins, or do we want to keep kind of, I don't want to say elitist, but do we want to keep kind of a higher standard? We don't want Clojure becoming PHP or JavaScript, right? And maybe that's inherited a little bit from cranky Emacs people who for a long time have been saying, hey, we don't want people bringing these newfangled things to Emacs. But with Clojure, I think there's maybe something we're thinking about there of what stands to be lost if you're not careful with your barrier to entry.
So I've been thinking a lot about this as well, because this is one of those things that is I've been trying to evangelize Clojure at different settings, but haven't really had much luck. And one of the things that I realized is so what is that barrier to entry? And from my perspective, it's to do chains of functional transforms requires a high degree of spatial skill in your head, which is something that we take for granted for academically trained CSers, but you don't get from boot campers. And that's fine, right? There are plenty of software engineering opportunities that don't require that. But if that's kind of built into how you even use the thing, then by definition, you've just kind of narrowed the scope of people who can even start approaching it. And I don't think necessarily it's a bad thing. again, like I think about like what makes a project inherently have inherent low turnover, at least in the commercial space. And, you know, I want to be working on things that feel academically interesting. So, you know, there's an alignment for me there personally, right? Like by definition, I go into that space and then I can make these choices that happen to align me, and I get some joy in my career. The other thing I would say is, I think the hiring problem, like what scares off a recruiting manager, I mean, it's all about that kind of branding, right? Like there's like a brand awareness to this stuff. And what I would love to see is some brand awareness around Clojure. Like I think successful projects would drive this, but like some notion that like, I want a venture capitalist to look at someone who's seed round and say like, oh, you're committing to doing this in Clojure. That means you're academically serious, right? Like I'm expecting something deep tech from you. Like there's some sort of mark of quality there. I would love to see that, and that be a driver of growth, because it's definitely not going to, wherever enterprise Java flourishes, that's not the Clojure space. It just isn't.
Yeah. You know, and I didn't mean to, I probably miscommunicated a little bit. The idea wasn't really to make it open to, I mean, the same is true with like Haskell, or, you know, if you apply it into a larger code base where you need a little bit of a larger team, not to be able to make it available for boot campers, but just like as an entrepreneur, it's like there's inherent risk there. There's major inherent risk. Like, will I find, and it's even, so Videra was a good example. Like, you know, we were all kind of stumbling through Clojure for the first time. That's sort of where I cut my teeth on Clojure. And it was like, there was a lot of like little stumbling blocks as far as, you know, and the problem is they add up. And so it's like, could we find someone who has really great skills, who could just come in and be like, bam, you know, here's, no, do this way, and here's why. You know, and it's like, okay, yeah, sure, we should have done it that way instead. So I don't know, it's really more like that, like how to get a larger body. And it's not really a problem. It's just one of those things that, I don't know, it just gives me anxiety when I'm like, yeah, I really love this cool functional language, and I want to start coding in it on my whatever next startup idea. And I'm like freaked out because it's like, will we actually be able to hire people who know it, who are willing to learn this? And, you know, it's like at that mid to upper level of coder, of course you can learn it. Like you can grasp the language, you can get the mechanics of it. Can you, in enterprise commercial viable, you know, the viability time frame of a startup that you have to deliver a profound degree of overwhelmingly high quality next level functionality in, and cut your teeth on a new language that's a little bit esoteric at the same time? Even if you're a gifted programmer, that might be, you know, challenging. I mean, hopefully any startup is doing a challenging task or target discipline to begin with. And so that it's just always something I grapple with, is like, I love these languages, I love Clojure. How can we as a community, you know, make it, make some of those things. And I think kind of what you guys are touching on though is actually a viable solution, like Metabase. Metabase is a good example. That's a really great high-end Clojure project that's totally open source. You know, one of my complaints that I used to harass the Datomic guys with was like, please open source your database. Not because I don't want you to have a business, you know, like we're willing to pay for it still, or buy even a support contract. But if it's open source and there's some kind of either performance nuance, I mean, especially performance, like if there's some performance nuance that I need to solve and you're closed source, guess what I'm doing? I'm decompiling your stuff. You know, like, and violating the license agreement. So why not just open source it? Have you guys tried, has anyone tried Crux? That looks like an interesting database.
Yeah, I know Jacob's big on. Jacob introduced me to it, and I played with it enough to think I love this almost as much as Jacob does.
Yeah, I've been using Crux quite helpfully since April or May, and Crux is just the bee's knees. I love Crux.
Right on. Are you doing Finca in it, Jacob?
Yeah. So Frank is for context for everyone else. Frank is my startup. So yeah, Crux is what I'm using for that. Also, my Clojure web framework BIF is built on Crux. So if you want to try it out, you can use BIF and get a whole web app started.
Dude, am I hearing like a maybe a next meetup presentation on Crux?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if I have energy to give another presentation soon, but I give.
So one of the things that I really like about, one of the cool things about Crux, and I wish I knew more about the organization behind them. So Juxt has done some really cool projects. They also create the tick time library, which we love to use. One of the things about Crux is if you follow them, so they're open source, and if you are tuned into their channels, they're very active. They're constantly at work. And I'm not sure how their business model works, but for those who aren't familiar, so the idea of Crux is that it is a bitemporal document database, which means that you can take unstructured data, so whether it's networking data like Facebook connections or anything else, and you not only have the data without SQL, so just in an unstructured format, but you also have it at any time point. So you can say, if I've got data on a city, I can go back and supposing I have the data, I can zoom back and say, hey, what was the city going on in 10 years ago or whatever? And I can go forward and backward in time. And on top of all of this, kind of about the company, they also have superb documentation. They have a really fun tutorial system, and they have really good communication about what they're up to. And so I think that's great. I have the impression that there aren't a lot of people working on this. It's not like a Red Hat project. It's got just probably a dozen or few, I'm guessing, based on who I see doing stuff.
I think it might be like 5 people or something. I really don't know.
Yeah, and that kind of ties into one more place I'd love the conversation to go based on what Dan was saying. And somebody mentioned, I can't remember if it was Dan or Brian, but somebody earlier mentioned sort of how companies love monoliths. They like to build things that can do as much as possible, and there are, I guess, money reasons that might be a good thing. But Clojure has a long tradition coming right down, well, as long as anything in Clojure is, coming right down from Cognitect, of really emphasizing small teams. We hear Stuart Holloway and we hear others talk about how they'll jokingly say, how long will it take this team of 20 to do this? How long will it take a team of 40 to do it? Twice as long. Adding people does not reduce production time in software engineering. And so Clojure has really optimized at small groups and smaller projects, and it really tries to empower them. Like you see it in the architecture of the language itself. And to me, that ties in a lot to what Dan was saying about the folklore, because the structure of folklore really depends on things not being too big, right? Because if you're being totally democratic with a big population, then you start to lose all the things that make folklore special, make it what it is. It dies.
Right. There's this optimization, this kind of benefit you get when you are willing to not write for everyone, when you're willing to make some sacrifices in terms of like ramp up that suddenly give you a bit of velocity. Sorry, I started interrupting you. I didn't know you weren't done. But I just had a thought on, this idea that, why big companies want monoliths, et cetera. And I think it stems basically from the same impulse in us that wants a clean API in anything. I think is the same impulse that makes a company want to say, look, I don't want 4 different teams that all have their own way of doing things. I just want like developers in liquid form that I can shuffle around as, at will, and they all kind of produce the same products. And because if they're all different, if they're all kind of esoteric, and each team has its own kind of way of doing things, that can be really hard to manage. The trouble is if you do want them standardized, then you suddenly start losing velocity because they don't get those kind of folklore benefits. And the only I think that the quote unquote best solution is if you give them an understanding, like, look, you can kind of do whatever you want. Like you know, we know you need that freedom, but be aware of the context that like whatever comes out at the other end, like does need, you know, needs to be simple in a Rich Hickey sense, I guess. It needs to be something easy to deal with. And I don't know that I think teams can do a lot. There's room for a lot of weird, esoteric, them specific stuff, as long as they optimize on some specific output for being easily consumable. You can do all sorts of weird things if you want in the pipeline, but whatever is consumed, I think that's where a lot of the focus needs to be. Anyway, that was just my thought on why they tend, why they try to see like a state. If anyone's familiar with that book, if they kind of treat software teams kind of like the U.S. treating Afghanistan. It should be easy, you know.
So as I mentioned earlier, I'm from an academic situation where, you know, I'm very far from concerns about venture capitals or investments or some of the insights that have been brought in. Does anybody here have a perspective on what we've been talking about from an industry perspective?
Hi guys. Maybe I can chip in on this. I'm joining from Brazil. I work at Nubank. Nubank is a digital bank. Uses Clojure very heavily. There are about, I don't know, by now 400 engineers working with Clojure. And to give maybe a counter example to what has been said regarding like fear of adoption of Clojure, right? Lack of maybe successful projects and things like that. The experience I've seen the past 4 years working there is that it wasn't a problem at all to hire people and train and make them like make good use of Clojure and other technologies related to Clojure and Datomic and things like that. Despite a lot of initial fear of, hey, like, are we going to be able to hire and train people in this? Like, this is like esoteric technology. But in the end, it seems like the onboarding and the ramp up to be to make good use of Clojure takes the same time as anything else. It doesn't seem there is like we have this perspective of thinking it's like a higher entry barrier, right? Like, okay, it's functional programming, you need to learn all these concepts about like immutability and things like that. Maybe that's a lot to learn, but in the end, it seems it's very easy to onboard people on the technology because there are some fundamental concepts that you need to learn, but after that, there is way less moving parts than just learning very complicated stack, a lot of concepts, or very complicated syntax or complicated libraries. So to give a counter example, it seems from my perspective and the perspective from the engineers trained on Clojure and making good use of it, it seems it's not hard at all. And maybe the best way to defeat the fear of adopting Clojure is to just adopt, just start using. And and show the barriers are the same as adopting any other technology in my perspective.
I'll say here to that.
One
I
thing
like that.
One thing I'll point out is the interop, the Java interop, and the fact that it compiles natively to Java bytecode. I know there's Clojure script, but that makes a huge difference because it means that like I can say, and I have done this, hey, we're working core Java or even Scala, but here's a few classes that I want to implement in Clojure. And you can get some incremental adoption that way. And it's a lot less scary because the fallback is Java, right? Anyway, I have to drop, unfortunately. I really enjoyed this. Thank you all. And I would welcome a talk on Crux. I've always been a bitemporal advocate. I make my staff put it into everything that we build. So yeah, I would love to join something like that. So thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Have a good night.
Do we have any other thoughts or questions that anyone wants to bring up before we split for the night?
So one thing that I think her name was Jenny, was it? She was, something she said made me think of, you know, like Clojure script. I don't know if you guys have looked at the JavaScript that generates, but man, that just gives me more heartburn than I know what to do with. And so she was talking about, I was thinking about, are there any efforts or has anyone thought about doing an implementation of Clojure script in WASM?
I know that has been a discussion to get WebAssembly language Clojure script. I don't know if anybody's taking it seriously right now. I know that, so you say it gives you heartburn. I'm not sure whether that's because it's so good or so bad.
Well,
Please.
Oh, sorry. Everything that's in the Lisp reader, right, is basically, so there's this layer of handling like calling and object packaging and unpackaging that's purely just to get the sort of an alignment between the JavaScript memory model and the calling model between that and Clojure. Right, so and it creates a big chunk. I don't know, it just feels like it's super inefficient because it's like every single call that you do, like everything is going through all of that code, and it's quite a lot. And it's handling basically calling, association, binding, you know, all that stuff. I mean, I guess it has to be done, but I don't know. I just always thought, what if you could just generate something that's much more, you know, I mean, and I guess that's going on at the Java level too. I just see it in clean source code rather than, you know, dumped JavaScript that's in the browser that's all kind of mangled. So maybe it's just that really, and the same things going on in Java. But it'd be interesting to see, can we do some kind of, you know, modern day compilers have come a long way, and there's possibly some like, you know, compile time tricks that you could do with metadata and that kind of thing that could make that kind of thing much more, you don't need to have so much runtime overhead, potentially.
So isn't the reason, so I don't know much about how the JVM side output looks, but on the JavaScript side, my understanding is that it is output the way it is so that it's fully compatible with Google Clojure, which gives you this kind of magic bullet that it has of doing advanced optimization and dead code elimination. And so I think that it produces a thing that is pretty structured. It has a lot of, you know, there are posts out there. If you look up Google Clojure, one of the first things that you'll see on results is this is the way you should not be writing JavaScript. You know, there's some opinionated stuff out there, but the fact is it produces this stuff that is remarkably cross-browser compatible, because Google stuff is, and it has the dead code elimination, which nothing else is like it as far as I know of in the JavaScript world.
No, that's cool, Tori. I'm glad I asked the question now, because I did not know or think about that. Did it might have something to do with the Google Clojure side?
I know that Scala has a JavaScript version, and it's also dependent on Google Clojure, but in apparently different ways than Clojure is. And I wonder if their code looked anything similar. I would guess it does, but I don't know.
Yeah. Huh, cool. Okay.
Well, I
So
have a
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Hi, sorry. I have a quick comment thinking a little bit about that regardless of the runtime or the runtime speed in some sense, I think a little bit of the reason that Clojure was so successful is because it could leverage all of the libraries that came from Java. So in some sense, if you had to imagine a world where every little bit of functionality, and for example, I use the PDF library, I forget which one, in Java, to have that get created to be functional, not a functional language, to be actual productive inside purely Clojure would, I think, be a little bit of a reach. And I think the same thing also happens with JavaScript. And I think you're right too, that a lot of the optimizations, Clojure, the Google Clojure compiler made Clojure script possible, if I remember reading in the sort of genesis story of Clojure script. But in some sense, we're all relegated to being a little bit weird because we love the language that we love. And I think it's only because we can stand on the shoulders of folks that are willing to deal with semicolons is that we get some of the benefits of that.
I think that I like that comment. I think it ties really into the same thing, or it ties into what Jenny mentioned, where she said, if worse comes to worse, you fall back to Java, and this was really one of the biggest compelling things for me to start with Clojure, is that this is viable because that huge problem any new language faces of community is solved in Clojure, because you've got one foot in the Java world, which when Clojure was created was the biggest community of libraries and repos, and the other foot in the JavaScript world, which is the current biggest. And so you have something that not many languages can say, as far as you automatically have everything available to you.
Right. And I think that's okay. And I think it's okay because not everybody loves parentheses. I would love it if more people did, but it is what it is. But
Yeah,
in
not
some sense, it
everybody
gives
agrees
us
with that SKCD that we saw earlier.
right.
There were a couple things brought up in the comments that I think we should probably just voice here. So they mentioned that one of the hardest things with Clojure is getting it set up, so getting things built, and I can't disagree with that. I'm an Emaxer, so I can never tell anybody about, hey, here's an easy setup, because it doesn't work that way. But we have had so much progress in that direction in the last few years between the VS Code and the IntelliJ and various solutions. But what at this point, for those who've gone through this onboarding process more recently, how does it feel to you? Would anything make that easier?
Yes,
I guess that's a bad discussion. It's too late to open that whole discussion up. But
I would actually argue that we're doing ourselves a little bit of a disservice. A cousin is trying to learn Clojure after being talked into it, partially by me. But when he looked at the README file that's at the Clojure.org, it didn't work at all for him in some sense. And I love Afer's sort of from the ground up Clojure series, And you know, that worked pretty well. I think part of it was just I don't know even know what happened in his setup, but literally here's a guy who wanted to get started and couldn't. And it wasn't until I spent, you know, half an hour on the phone with him, he was like, oh, this is weird. And I was like, here, let me blow your mind one more time. Type macro expand, and poof, another one. And oh, here, you know, type source here, poof, and take a look. Oh, let's look at let, you know. So I mean, and you know, if he could have had that himself, that would have been, I think, a lot easier. I don't know what failed there exactly though. So nothing.
Yeah, what was the main? Did he have like problems just actually getting it to be able to run and compile, or
he did the homebrew something, brew something, something, CLJ something, something, and I saw a screenshot of it and I was like, I don't know. I use lean. Let's use,
okay.
you know.
Yeah, brews. I mean, brews one good way to get the. I installed via lean also. That was super cake, right?
Right.
One thing for me, the biggest challenge was I was on a Windows box at the time, and the class path that was generated for the Java jars plus the Clojure jars was exceeded the 32K limit that Windows has on its class path length.
Wow, there's a sad trombone sound somewhere.
Right? Yeah. And I was on a computer that I had brought back from Berlin, so it had like 8 gigs of RAM, I think, on it. So it was just enough to be, you know, it was my development machine there, but it was just on Windows. I didn't need to run a virtual machine. So when I fired up VMware with, or maybe it was VirtualBox, but with a Ubuntu, it would run it, but literally you click on a button or anything, and it would take like a minute to do all the paging. So yeah, that was kind of a shocker.
Yeah, there's probably an easier entry point. I don't know if we're gonna solve it here tonight though.
No, it was just it was as my first setup or intro to Clojure. That was really the only stumbling block. You know, like you said, line, and then what were the other components? I thought I also did brew install, but that might be on a different. Now I don't know about you guys, but I run from the source code. I just download it and then build it and do a local install. And there's some painful setup stuff I have to do to get some binary scripts on my command line. But other than that, it's I think that's a cool way to go, because then you can play around with the source at the same time.
I helped a little bit by teaching my 7-year-old daughter Clojure first.
Right on.
You've done your part.
Right.
I think one of the challenges I've heard some people mention is not necessarily about the installing of Clojure, but the tooling, where, I work with teams in several languages, and for some of them, I work with a lot of students doing PHP, and I say, hey, use whatever you want. It's PHP, you can, and so they can use VS Code or Notepad++ or whatever they want to use. And then I'll have students come to Clojure, and they've never dealt with this before. And I have to explain to them, no, here the editor actually matters. You don't have to use Emacs, but you need something with a REPL, something that can give you this kind of feedback, because you could use Notepad++, but you would be cutting yourself so short.
Yeah, big time, right?
Yeah, I think that might be part of what the question is for, how to get set up, because it's true that there's other languages. If you're writing Python, you don't care about having a REPL going or something.
To chime in as a total beginner of Clojure, I learned from scratch programming and Clojure script kind of simultaneously. I actually found it quite easy to get up to speed compared to, let's say, JavaScript. So I don't think I could have learned, I'm actually learning JavaScript after Clojure script. And maybe it's because I had a free mind and I wasn't tainted in any way. I actually found Clojure script much easier to get started with than something else. So for what it's worth, maybe it's the preconceptions that get in the way. So maybe being a 7-year-old is where to start.
Yeah,
That's that's a great perspective, Peter. At work, we have the same experience too. It's harder to teach to senior software engineers some concepts than the fresh out of college students.
Corey, you've run into that too, I think, haven't you?
Yeah, I was gonna say I have within college, I have that problem where over the years I've hired a number of different types of people, and I always have a better experience hiring those who are in their first year or two of school than those who are like seniors. Because the seniors come along with everything they've learned in class and all of the concepts they have to unlearn, and they never, usually they quit. They never get into the Clojure, really.
Corey,
Yeah, I
what is
think-
your stack there that you're working on? We've never really gone into that.
So it's based on Luminous. So
Okay.
it's a full stack with web stack. We use Clojure script on the front end. We use Postgres as a database, and we use now we use Reframe on the front end. So that's the bulk of our work.
You're doing, I mean, I know you're in the humanities group, and I've looked at your pages, the website a couple times. It seems like you're taking you're doing linguistics analysis, yeah?
I would like to. I don't do very much of that right now, but
Okay. Okay, interesting.
yeah, my training is in linguistics, but at the moment that's not where my where my employment is.
Got it. Okay. It was just they had talked a little bit about some projects that they had going on, so I just kind of inferred that you guys were doing linguistic analysis of like classical texts of Homer's Iliad and that kind of thing.
Some of our group is doing stuff like that, but on the Clojure side, not so much right yet. Right now, our Clojure work is very kind of boring stuff, I guess, for making products that the administrators or the others use. I guess one of the ones that several people here are working on is for language teaching. So it's a language test that people pay for to get college credit for. But that's about as academic as we are right now.
I got you. So you're doing like systems type programming and system support.
Yeah, we do a lot of CRUD at the moment.
Okay, right on. At the end of the day, man, it's like even in machine learning, I'm doing a lot of machine learning stuff right now. And I've been thinking about it a lot. It's like a lot of the core like mathematics isn't really that new. There's no like fundamental, there wasn't this Nobel event where suddenly a new theory was of mathematics or whatever was produced. And it's really the speed of being able to have quick access to tons of data and being able to fast pipeline that. And then using that to train the models, right? And so, so you can get that set of permutations going. And it's like, it's interesting. It also is data plumbing at the end of the day. And it's like, if you look at Google's stuff, I mean, they haven't come out and said it, but it's like, if you read their papers and you kind of read between the lines, they're coming out with stuff at such a rate where it's like, okay, they've done some really great engineering on the data management and data pipelining side to be able to very quickly iterate on their models and on different theories and ideas, because they're trying stuff out so fast. And it's like, so the innovation, I mean, kind of a assumption a little bit, but there's a little bit of guideposts that you can find along the way, is that they're really innovating just as much on the data pipelining pieces as they are in the core algorithms. So it's, we're all CRUD people at the end of the day, I feel like.
Well, I would like to joke that any web or mobile app, really the developer is just converting mouse clicks into SQL statements.
Right? Too much. Yep.
Got to keep it simple.
Well, I have to go as well, but thank you guys so much for coming and listening to my. I don't mean to shut it down. I just want to say thanks for listening to me talk. And anyway,
thanks,
I gotta
thanks for your ideas, Dan. That was great.
Yeah, his round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.
All right, cool. I don't think, guys, do we have anything on for, do we have anything scheduled yet for next month?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
I know you talked a while ago about some potential ideas.
Yes. So, and I'm having that feeling again tonight of that talk on essentially Clojure, the development environment itself. And so, yeah, my only thing is I'm sort of doing I have a kind of a startup project I've been pouring myself into over the last couple of months, but I feel fairly, how about this, Jacob? I'll make you a deal. If I do that next month, Clojure development environment, so I'll do it for February. Will you do Crux in March?
How about?
I also think we should get somebody from Juxt to come. That would be great.
That's a great idea, Tori. That's a really great idea. Okay, we'll have to work on that.
No, maybe we could, because I've done some stuff with Crux, and so Tori, have you been using Crux in production, or have you just played around with it?
No, I haven't. So I was using it for my PhD project, which is on hold at the moment. So I just had a brief flirtation and fell in love enough, but haven't had a chance to get back to it yet.
Yeah, because I wonder, maybe we could just have, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 people give like a mini presentation and just screen share and say, here's like something that I've done with Crux, you know, one of my apps or something. I don't know, random idea.
I mean, I feel
That would
like,
be cool if we can round up 3 or 4.
well, the thing about Crux, though, I feel like Crux is definitely something worth doing a deep dive on. You know, like here's what it looks like from the kind of the classical web application model. Sure, here's your to-do app or whatever, and the neat things that the bitemporality gives us. But now let's go super deep and let's show what it can really do, and kind of take it out there and get all 12 cylinders revving, you know, and see what that looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's get one of their guys, because they do like vid posts and things periodically to give like updates to the community. So I'm sure they would be happy to come.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Let's do that. And then
That would be a
yeah,
great presentation.
I'll tentatively commit for late February for
Yes.
all right, cool.
Well, this
All right,
turned out
guys,
pretty well for me.
What's that?
This turned out to be a good deal for me.
Right on. Yeah, I did.
I accept your deal.
You didn't even say anything, Jacob. He just
And I'll
nodded.
pass it
agreement.
off to Juxt.
No, it's one of those things I've done, you know, it's essentially half completed already. It's just yeah, so I think it can be done in a short while, and I think everyone would benefit from it. Like, it comes up a lot, you know, like what is the full spectrum of dev environments for Clojure, and to what degree of like sort of traversability of the code base do those environments allow? And that makes a big difference, you know, it makes a huge difference in your coding. So yeah, I think it's a needed presentation. So got anything
All right.
else?
Well, good night, guys.
Thanks
All right,
again, everyone. Good night, guys.
Hey, it's
Thank
great
you,
meeting-
everybody.
Yeah.
And,
All right. Take care, everyone.
And we'll have this uploaded on the YouTube channel at some
Sweet.
point too.
Right on.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
See ya.
See ya.